Controlling the center immediately, this pawn opens diagonals for queen and bishop, hinting at an aggressive setup. Instantly developing a knight, black establishes a flexible pawn structure, keeping options open for queenside or kingside pawn breaks. Developing the knight naturally prepares kingside castling and supports a central pawn advance, keeping options open. Black prepares to develop their king's bishop, aiming for a solid pawn structure while acknowledging white's central pawn. Solidifying the center, white prepares development while subtly limiting black's immediate counterplay in the pawn structure. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop to b7, aiming for long-range pressure on the queenside diagonal. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal prepares for castling while eyeing potential kingside expansion. Developing the bishop to target the d4 pawn adds a crucial diagonal pressure to white's central pawn structure. Securing the monarch is paramount, freeing other pieces for central engagement. Boldly challenging white's central control, this pawn push immediately ignites the position and opens avenues for bishop activity. Centering the pawn structure with this move aims to solidify white's central control and potentially prepare a queenside pawn advance, creating a dynamic imbalance on the board. Prioritizing piece harmony, this development shores up the queenside and prepares for an eventual d5 pawn push. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies central control, preparing for potential pawn advances and adding pressure along the c-file, while also offering defensive support for the d4 pawn. Opening the center immediately, black confronts the pawn chain's central pillar, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious pawn structure and potentially unleash their own queenside counterplay. This exchange simplifies the position, trading central tension for open lines, and may signal an intent to actively challenge white's queenside development or prepare for a central pawn push later. Opening the e-file now allows white's rook potential to reach the center, while simultaneously relieving the cramped feeling on the kingside and preparing to contest the open c-file. The king finds immediate safety behind the pawns, a prudent decision before the central tension escalates further, allowing for a more coordinated development of the queenside. Suddenly, a pivotal pawn thrust opens up aggressive central play, aiming to cramp black's queenside development and seize a lasting space advantage. Seeking active squares, the knight ventures to the flank, eyeing the central tension created by d5, hoping to reroute towards c7 or even b4 if the pawn structure shifts, a bold redirection that might surprise white's established central control. A strategic redeployment, reinforcing the central pawn chain while preparing to contest the d-file and potentially launch a queenside expansion. Harnessing the queen's influence to pressure white's central pawn complex is a sound idea, seeking to disrupt the established pawn chains and potentially open lines for counterplay. A subtle maneuver, this bishop redeploy aims to pin the knight, potentially disrupting black's central control and creating opportunities to exploit the now less protected kingside. Challenging the bishop's influence and forcing white to commit its pieces further is a sound defensive strategy, aiming to break the opponent's piece coordination and potentially open lines for counterplay. Liberating the bishop from its pawn chain, this exchange aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened kingside. Regaining the bishop immediately solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares for potential future pressure on the d-file. However, the loss of the bishop pair grants white a slight long-term positional advantage by controlling more squares with their remaining minor piece. Unleashing the queen to the central thoroughfare, white immediately challenges black's structural integrity and probes for weaknesses around the king, aiming to exploit the temporarily less active g7 bishop while developing an attacking presence. Sharpening the kingside pawn structure with g6 presents a dual-edged sword. It bolsters the monarch's safety by creating an escape square and prepares for potential kingside play, yet simultaneously weakens the light squares, a potential target for white's pieces if not carefully managed. The queen repositions to a more active square, eyeing the d5 pawn and simultaneously preparing for a potential pawn advance on the queenside, aiming to restrict black's pieces. Reclaiming the bishop's diagonal, black repositions their dark-squared bishop to g7, a classic fianchetto square that shores up the kingside and prepares for potential queenside play or pressure on the long diagonal. This seemingly quiet maneuver subtly enhances kingside safety while keeping options open, a prudent defensive reinforcement against white's developing central control and potential piece activity. Radically shifting focus, white redirects the rook's energy towards the open d-file, preparing for a potential d5 push or utilizing it as a staging ground for further central penetration. Black captures the pawn, but this creates immediate tactical complications and opens up lines for white's pieces towards the king's flank, a rather audacious choice given the current pawn structure. Unleashing a knight's initiative, this bold repositioning aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit the open lines, potentially targeting weaknesses around the enemy king while simultaneously reinforcing white's central presence. Reassessing the pawn structure and piece placement, the queen regains its central post. Unleashing a potent pawn thrust, white immediately assaults the weakened queenside and aims to cramp black's development, potentially opening lines towards the enemy king. Black's queen, now exposed on c5, becomes a tempting target, inviting a cascade of tactical skirmishes as white's pieces converge on the queenside, a stark contrast to the quiet pawn push that preceded it. The immediate exchange of queens on c5 is a significant decision, drastically altering the strategic landscape from a complex middle game to a more open, potentially tactical endgame. White's aggressive pawn push on move 17 created this dynamic, and by simplifying here, white aims to leverage their more developed pieces and control over central squares, specifically the d-file, which is now open for white's rook after the queen trade. Black, conversely, needs to be acutely aware of white's increased influence and potential for quick advances with their remaining pieces, especially the knight on e5. The resulting position will demand precise piece play from black to avoid falling behind in development or creating critical weaknesses around their king. A pivotal moment arrives as the knight decisively lands on a central outpost, poised to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially threaten the weakened d6 pawn. Solidifying the central pawns, this maneuver prepares to activate the king's knight and potentially contest the now open e-file, while also creating a defensive shield for the monarch. Pushing that pawn forward aims to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially open lines for black's rooks, though it does create a structural weakness around the king. This pawn thrust aggressively probes black's queenside pawns, aiming to disrupt their structure and potentially gain a foothold for white's pieces on the newly created outpost. Abandoning the central pawn creates a dynamic pawn structure, potentially opening the kingside for black's attack, but it also grants white significant central influence and a protected passed d, pawn that will soon demand attention. Reinforcing the kingside initiative, this rook repositions, eyeing potential breakthroughs and preparing to support a central advance, adding pressure to black's precarious pawn structure. The knight's journey to the queenside seeks to establish a more active role, escaping the cramped limitations of the kingside and potentially challenging white's control over the c5 square. A well-placed bishop can dominate key diagonals, and this repositioning aims to eye the kingside and potentially support a kingside attack while also defending the e4 square. Black boldly grabs the pawn, gambling on the open lines their pieces can exploit, but this action could leave their queenside structure precarious and expose the king to potential mating threats from white's centralized queen and rooks. Reclaiming the rook opens up the f-file for potential future pressure, and more importantly, it challenges black's advanced knight, which has found a curious outpost on a6. White's intention here is likely to disrupt black's slightly awkward coordination and exploit the open lines that might arise from this exchange. Consider how this rook now eyes the c7 square, and the potential for it to swing over to the queenside if black isn't careful with their pawn structure. Navigating into this knight outpost on c6, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the queenside, a bold maneuver after the recent exchanges which have opened up the center and king's wing. Sacrificing the knight opens up the bishop's diagonal and aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure. Black recaptures the piece, immediately activating the bishop and creating an imbalance in material. This exchanges a potentially dangerous knight for a well-placed bishop, opening up the c-file for future action. Shifting the knight to a central outpost suddenly unlocks the bishop's diagonal and prepares a swift advance of the kingside pawns. Embracing the initiative, Black ignites a fascinating tactical skirmish by pushing the f-pawn, challenging White's central grip and aiming to open lines for his pieces. This bold advance not only creates immediate tension, but also seeks to disrupt White's coordinated setup, particularly the bishop on b1, which now faces potential exposure. Chasing that misplaced knight across the board, White strategically repositions their own monarch's protector, preparing to bolster the weakened kingside and contest the open file that's developing. Liberating the bishop from its constrained diagonal opens up aggressive avenues towards White's vulnerable queenside pawn structure and allows for potential counterplay along the c-file, while also preparing for a future advance of the f-pawn to challenge White's central control and piece activity. Clearing a path for the remaining rook to join the attack, Re2 aims to activate White's queenside presence and challenge the newly established black bishop outpost on c3, potentially leading to a more dynamic material imbalance or a squeeze along the e-file. Activating the rook along the open file is the logical step, aiming to challenge the opponent's central control and establish an active presence on the board. Bolstering the bishop on d3 aims to solidify White's control over the central dark squares, particularly the e4 square, preparing for a potential advance of the kingside pawns or a regrouping of pieces to attack Black's somewhat passive structure. Unleashing a pawn to contest the queenside and create counterplay on the open file, Black disrupts White's currently comfortable pawn structure and seeks to activate the rook. A daring plunge towards the enemy king, sacrificing a pawn for a sudden frontal assault, aiming to destabilize Black's defense before the pieces can fully regroup. The bishop's journey to b4, while seemingly active, sacrifices precious tempo and allows White to consolidate their advantage on the kingside with an immediate threat to the rook. Securing the kingside pawn structure against potential knight incursions. Seizing that bishop offers a dynamic positional concession, aiming to disrupt White's central pawn structure and potentially open up the kingside for counterplay. Recapturing on the f-file restores material balance, but critically it vacates the e2 square, allowing Black's rook to potentially infiltrate and exert pressure along the second rank or even aim for the king's defenses. The pawn structure is rather fractured, with White having doubled pawns on the f-file and Black possessing an isolated pawn. But the immediate consequence of this recapture is a shift in the initiative towards Black, as their pieces gain more active squares and potential attacking avenues. Exploiting the newfound openness on the queenside, Black injects dynamism into the position, aiming to activate the b-pawn and potentially establish a passed pawn on that flank, as White's king remains somewhat exposed by the lack of defensive pieces. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside now, White aims to pry open lines towards Black's monarch, but at the cost of seriously weakening his own king's pawn shield and creating potential targets on the light squares. Black's pawn sacrifice opens a diagonal for the bishop and aims to disrupt White's pawn structure, creating potential counterplay on the kingside where White's monarch remains somewhat exposed after recent pawn advances. Unleashing the knight to f6 immediately creates a potent threat against the Black king's sanctuary. White is essentially forcing a king shuffle, aiming to exploit the exposed nature of Black's monarch. Observe how this aggressive knight maneuver opens up potential avenues for further penetration, perhaps even targeting squares like g7 or h7, depending on Black's defensive response. The move capitalizes on the recent pawn exchange on g4, which has softened the pawn structure around the king. This isn't just about forcing material exchanges. It's about seizing the initiative and dictating the terms of engagement by directly challenging the safety of the opposing monarch. Relocating the king away from the immediate danger zone on the g-file is paramount, creating a vital escape route and acknowledging the open nature of the position. Exploiting the open diagonal, this knight's foray immediately targets the exposed Black king, threatening a fork that could shatter the defensive structure and pave the way for decisive material gains. Recognizing the immediate double check and the forced retreat, black opts to maintain the central presence of the king, tucking it away on the h8 square while still keeping a watchful eye on the d8-h4 diagonal. This defensive maneuver prioritizes king's safety above all else in a moment of tactical urgency, preparing for potential complications arising from white's knight's aggressive positioning. Capturing the rook initiates a decisive simplification into a favorable endgame where white's passed pawn on the d-file, and the potential activity of the knight will be paramount. The rook captures the rook, a forced exchange that simplifies the board and steers us toward an endgame where black's remaining pieces must work in harmony to defend against white's initiative and potential passed pawns. Exploiting the open file is paramount now, forcing black's king into a far less secure position. The black bishop, having completed its journey across the board, now aims to disrupt white's monarch, leveraging the open diagonal it has secured. The sovereign escapes the immediate check, seeking refuge on a brighter square, but the looming danger of black's bishop pair and the open files continue to exert significant pressure on white's position. The rook's journey to f1 signifies a desperate attempt to salvage some attacking potential or create a stalemate threat, but it overlooks the immediate danger posed by white's bishop on c2, which now has a clear path to deliver mate on h7 after a subsequent kh2. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal power offers a promising path to reignite white's initiative and pressure black's somewhat compromised kingside pawn structure. Unleashing a desperate check, black hopes to disrupt white's now dominant piece arrangement and force a more favorable pawn structure, though the white king appears quite secure behind its fortress. Sacrificing the rook to achieve a decisive king hunt, forcing the opponent into a passive defense. This exchange simplifies the material and clarifies the central tension. Black's bishop now steps into an open diagonal, immediately targeting white's now weakened king's safety and potentially activating itself on the queen side. Securing the central files with the bishop now clears the path for the rook to become active, and after the upcoming exchange, white's king should find a much safer haven. The pawn advanced to c6 now solidly anchors black's central structure and completes the pawn chain's consolidation, a necessary maneuver to avoid further pressure on the c-file. The monarch's maneuver to g2 aims to secure the king from the immediate checks and prepare for a potential rook sortie, though the pawn structure remains significantly compromised. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active post where it can eye the queenside pawns and potentially support a future queenside advance, rather than passively defending the now exposed king. Securing the knight's retreat to a superior outpost on a central square allows for future kingside pressure. Unleashing the central pawn is a bold step, aiming to disrupt white's knight outpost and potentially open lines towards the kingside. This knight's advance forces the black king into a precarious defensive posture, directly challenging the pawn shield and threatening immediate exposure. The king's desperate scramble for safety through squares like g7 highlights the precariousness of the monarch's position as the opponent's knights eye entry points. Repositioning the knight to target the weak pawns and prepare for potential advances on the kingside. The pawn on c5 lunges forward, creating a barrier and challenging white's central control, aiming to activate the bishop on d4 and disrupt white's potentially dominant knight. Forking the black king and the knight on c5, this knight move forces a king retreat, repositioning white's knight to a more active square and setting up potential threats. The black king, having escaped the immediate threats on the queen side, now finds itself in a precarious central position, exposed to the knight's aggressive foray. Harnessing the central outpost, the knight boldly ventures deep into enemy territory, threatening to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit any defensive laxity. Unlocking the pawn chain and opening a diagonal for the bishop is a bold attempt to inject life into a seemingly passive position. Opening up the kingside further, this maneuver aims to activate the remaining pieces and target black's pawn structure. Pushing the pawn forward seems to be an attempt to create some queenside counterplay, perhaps aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure or open a path for the knight if it ever gets to a better square. However, this pawn advance appears rather slow given the current material on the board and the exposed position of black's king. Asserting control over the central square with that knight shift immediately threatens to penetrate black's pawn structure and create outposts for white's remaining pieces. Unlocking the queenside pawn majority with this advance creates immediate pressure, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn of its own. Pawn structure reorganization to penetrate the queenside is now the priority. The pawn's advance shatters the pawn chain, opening a new attacking avenue and threatening to break through the enemy defense. A pivotal king maneuver, this ventures deep into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's advanced pawn majority and potentially create passed threats of its own. A bold gambit in a complex endgame where even slight positional advantages can be decisive. The pawn's advance to b2 dramatically alters the endgame landscape, creating a vital passed pawn that demands immediate attention and opens a new avenue for potential breakthroughs, even as the opposing king's safety becomes a growing concern. Activating the knight to centralize and prepare for the pawn pushes promotion dance. The pawn storm's fury finally breaks as this central advance attempts to exploit the newly created highway towards white's king, aiming to destabilize its defensive structure after a series of exchanges and pawn pushes. The knight's retreat to its starting square is a decisive maneuver, aiming to exploit the awkward placement of black's pawn and restore some semblance of balance to white's forces after a complex middle-game tussle. The king is finally emerging, seeking a more active role in the endgame, but placing it on the 5th rank invites scrutiny and potential attacks along the open files.